our first official podcast with Cassie Yost and Brittany Clark. Cassie Yost is a dairy educator for Franklin County, and we have Brittany Clark, who's a field and forage crops for Franklin County. So thank you so much for joining us. And this is a very special time of the year as we move into the coldest months of the year, and you have some really valuable information to share with our followers here on our YouTube channel. So I'll first of all start with Cassie, dairy educator for Franklin County, and talk a little bit about moving forward through the winter months, how farmers can prepare as they go in through December, January, and February.
Sure. Thank you for having us today. My specialty falls in calves and heifers, so I'll predominantly be talking about the young stock on the farms, but a couple of the just general things to keep in mind during our cold winter months are bedding levels in our calf hutches, in our group housing. We want to have, a nice, generous, dry bedding available to those age groups. A couple of things that can be done. There's something we call a knee test, where if you get down onto your knee in those pens and your knees become wet, then it's obvious that those calves need some more bedding. We want to make sure that water is available at all times, especially when it's freezing. We want to make sure those calves do have access to fresh water. We want to make sure those communal drinkers do not become frozen so that those animals are without water. And then there's oftentimes farmers will use curtains on the backs of their buildings. We want to maintain a good level for those curtains that will protect against the winds, but not shut up those pens too tight. We do want some fresh air into those pens, but we definitely don't want drafts on any of these ages of animals. We want to think about nutrition, especially in severe weather swings. When temperatures fall to the low minimums, we want to adjust those nutritional requirements for some of those calves, because they're going to be using some of that energy from their feed to actually maintain their body temperature. So we want to have enough nutrients where they're actually able to use it for maintenance and growth as well. So just some of the very broad.
Now, you mentioned that the water can become frozen, the water that they drink. Now, traditionally, I would expect that the water would have to be a lot colder than the freezing mark to be frozen. That would probably occur during an extended period of cold weather. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. You can see kind of grouped water troughs in the older calf barns, maybe like some weaned groups. You can see those drinkers actually freeze up from the inside sometimes in really cold snaps. You just want to make sure everything's kind of functioning properly.
And so far, we've had a fairly mild winter. And looking forward, I would say that the best chance for an extended period of cold weather would be the back half of our winter. So we're looking at likely like late January into February is when we would have the best chance for the longest cold snaps across the Mid-Atlantic, including Pennsylvania. You did mention that drafts when it comes to the wind. So across the Mid-Atlantic, and especially in Pennsylvania, the primary wind direction, which includes the strongest winds, will be out of the west and northwest. That's when you tend to get the strongest winds, and that would tend to be when you have the most significant drafts.
And another issue that farmers also face is when they do use individual calf hutches for housing, and some farmers do like to orient their calf hutches differently in the summer months versus winter months. Could you maybe tell your listeners what the best orientation for those hutches would be during the winter months, especially when they want to capture that sunlight coming in and warming those calves up?
Yeah, so in the wintertime, the sun is on the southern horizon, so the warmest part and the part that would have the most sunlight is your southern-facing property. And that's also the part of the property where, after a winter storm, the snow would first melt, would be that southern-facing area of the property. and the strongest wind drafts would be out of the west and northwest part of the property.
And then another thing with the young calves is we have a thing called their thermo-neutral zone. Calves are most comfortable around 50 to 68 degrees. So anything below that 50 degrees is actually going to put them into some level of cold stress. Obviously, as temperatures dip down even further, it's those small calves that are affected the most. And that's when we talk about, the adequate bedding. We can also put calf jackets on those calves. We just want to be aware of temperature swings. If we get those days that fall into really warm conditions, we don't want to keep those jackets on those calves because they can actually sweat in underneath of there. So then if our temperatures are going to dip down at night, we just want to kind of keep that in mind. If we do have some calves with jackets on, whether we need to adjust that a little bit, if we get those days where we can get some really warm days and then those temperatures dip down low at night.
Yeah, and speaking of which, I do expect the cold outbreaks in the first part of the winter. We are in the first part of the winter now, but going forward through most of January, I think those cold snaps that we have in the Mid-Atlantic will be rather brief, and they will be followed by some warm weather. But looking at the back half of the winter, I do think we'll have somewhat longer periods of colder weather, so adequate bedding will definitely be needed as we go through February and into the first part of March. So those temperature swings will be pretty generous in the first part of the winter as we're seeing right now. And then once we get into the back half of the winter, we'll still have those temperature swings, but the cold snap might be a little bit longer than just a couple of days as we go throughout the February into the first part of March. We also have with us Brittany Clark, Field and Forage Crops for Franklin County. And now, Brittany, you were talking a little bit earlier about the impacts of drought on the fall crops before we got onto this session. So can you tell us exactly how the dry weather in Pennsylvania has impacted the crops?
Sure. So thanks, Chad. We actually had a significant portion of the state that was classified as abnormally dry or moderately dry by the USDA Drought Monitor. That's typically where I'm going for kind of our evaluation on the state's drought condition. And so a majority of our county, particularly in the area of the county where I live in Waynesboro, we were experiencing moderate drought conditions for the majority of our soybean as well as our corn for silage and grain growing season. We also had significant impacts to forage, and the primary impact was yield. We took a yield hit just due to limited moisture availability. There are some people that irrigate in the area. That is a potential way to manage moisture. But a majority of our agronomic management techniques were kind of at that vulnerability to the environment. Something that I would kind of notice during interactions with clients this year is we had a lot of corn silage that experienced droughty conditions test high for nitrate. So that's a recommendation that I have for dairy producers or others growing corn silage. In a dry year, we see that heavily manured fields can accumulate nitrates in the stalk. And so something I'd recommend is testing that feed. And if it's testing hot, potentially thinking about ensiling that as opposed to maybe doing just green chop, letting it go through that fermentation process. So in summary, that drought led to significant yield loss, but also some nitrate poisoning risks for our livestock and feed in the area. Mm-hmm.
And indeed, the drought not only impacted the farmers, like you said, with the crops and the yields, but there's a very distinct difference in the stream flow levels from Interstate 95 to the coast, where stream flow is above average. But once you get back west of Interstate 95, especially across northern Pennsylvania, stream flow is below average. So definitely the drought is definitely visible with the stream flow. But I will say this, going forward through the winter time, with the typical La Nina pattern, we tend to have storm tracks west of the Appalachians, which means that, and it's good to have the rain brought back into an area of drought. So I do think there will be some recovery in that drought across Pennsylvania going forward through the winter time, thanks to the storm track with a La Nina. Now, speaking of that, if we get back on par here with our precipitation across Pennsylvania, will that perhaps lead to development, better yields in the first part of the summer season next year if we continue that trend through the spring?
I think, can't comment on potentially, let me see. I think right now my main question would be, what's actually planted right now is really kind of our winter cereal crops or cover crops. And so I think the question I'm kind of asking myself as far as weather patterns is, and I would have questions for you. So, these cereal crops go through a period of dormancy. So they want to get below their developmental threshold, and this is the time where we're beyond planting. Most of these cereal crops need to be in late September, early October. There are some different cereal crops that can tolerate being planted into December. Things like rye are more hardy as opposed to things like barley and wheat that can be a little bit more sensitive. But when I think about these in early spring and moisture levels, I'd be curious to hear your take on maybe what the probability of ice or some serious snow cover would look like. We've got a lot of biomass on the field right now, and I'm recommending that folks even potentially chop if they're reaching a height of 10 to 12 inches, take a high cut if they can scatter and spread evenly or get that off. But these fields are going to be really vulnerable to maybe snow molds or suffocation by ice. So I'd love to hear your take on what that could look like for these fields.
Yeah, we've had a very mild start to the winter, that is for sure. In terms of snowpack, the best snowpack that we are going to see this winter is going to be in February into the middle of March. So I talked briefly with Cassie about the temperatures variations going forward through the winter time, and we're seeing the mild start, and the cold snaps are going to be rather short-lived. I think that snow cover in general for the winter is going to be below average across Pennsylvania, but if I had to section it off a bit, I would say that most of the snow cover, the longest extent of snow cover, is going to occur in February into the early part of March. That's when we'll have more days with snow cover on the ground compared to the month of January. And we will have some of these warm spells through the end of December and through January, and the cold spells should be fairly limited until we get to February into the first part of March. So that's going to be the core of our winter time. But in terms of extreme cold weather, I do think that if we do have any extreme colds, which would be the initiation of wind chill advisories, that would likely occur for a couple of days, a handful of days, I think, in February. So that's what we're looking at in terms of snow cover and temperatures for the winter time across Pennsylvania.
Sure. If we have that snow cover kind of overlapping with those extreme colds, typically we see a buffering of that temperature that small grain or cereal will experience. In areas where we don't see that snow cover, but we have those advisories, my recommendations to producers would be, when we start to get into late March or mid-March for green up, I'd also like maybe your take as to when we'd start to see that uptick in that kind of time some of our management decisions as well in spring. Not trying to jump too ahead, but
Right.
I'd definitely recommend producers to be scouting fields that have, no snow cover, but maybe experiencing these temperature extremes for looking at winter kill, especially with the lush growth we have now. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I do think moving forward past March into April that it'll be probably the middle of April, which will be the last hard freeze of the season, And then I believe once we get into late April into May, we will have a few cold snaps, but unlike this year, when we actually had a random hard freeze or two in May, I do not anticipate that happening in 2021. I think once we get past the last freeze of the season, again, that does vary across Pennsylvania because of the different climates, but basically across northern Pennsylvania into central Pennsylvania, that would be right around the middle part, or maybe the northern part closer to the 20th, 21st, central and southern part middle of April. But I don't see any risk for a very late season cold snap in May, but that's what we're looking at temperatures going forward through the springtime.
You're going to make a lot of people happy if you're right, Chad. We had definitely took some hits in barley last year. A significant number of fields ended up going to be cut for silage or forage instead of grain. Had significant frost impacts, as you mentioned. So that's good to know that maybe we could have less of that risk this year. Mm-hmm.
And one thing that you mentioned, we were talking a little bit earlier, is there's a item called the growing degree units. Now, in meteorology, we also have cooling and heating degree days, which the energy sector uses to determine how much homes and businesses had to use heat to stay warm or air conditioning to stay cool, with the base unit being 65 to 70 degrees. Most businesses and homes keep their temperature regulated between those two marks. There's something similar to that you mentioned in the agricultural industry. And so far this winter, we are trending above average for those numbers. Is that correct?
Absolutely. We have some software systems that we utilize. There's a free system actually through Cornell University. They have climate smart farming that you can utilize this program for free. But we have a paid program that we use to capture this unit that you mentioned. We call it growing degree days in agriculture, and we use it to track the development of things like insects, but also our crops. And our crops have a minimum developmental threshold or temperature above which they continue to develop. And using our daily mins and max, we can capture that rate of development. And it's, as you said, in our area, we're definitely trending upwards of our growing degree. And on the other hand, we have a little bit of a moisture deficit that's continued. So I think we could see potential yield hits. But right now, most things are in a period of dormancy, although some of our small grains have had definite days where we've been still producing here in December, which is quite unusual. Mm-hmm.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that information, Brittany.
Absolutely.
And
thank you.
Now I'll turn it over to both you, Casey, and Brittany, if you have any additional information that you want to release, or any questions for me with respect to how the agricultural industry can prepare for the upcoming winter and early spring.
I think my last piece of advice that I would impart to growers is that, a lot of people in our area reach for these very long season corn and soybean varieties, and that gives you a late harvest date. And if you're really into treating your winter cereals or your cover crops as a main commodity and want to get your best return on investment, I'd consider sharpening those harvest dates, maybe picking a variety that comes off earlier in the fall so that we can get our optimum planting dates in late September, October for our species. Often that's a challenge, and also ties into equipment availability and workforce on each operation. But that's kind of my last nugget for folks, is we've got a lot of short season varieties that are producing as well. So,
Okay, thank you.
And I guess I would just kind of reiterate the fact in our young stock, whether it be our calves or our weaned calves, We just need to kind of work with those temperature swings. We need to understand that, sometimes if we need a light jacket, that's when our calves are most comfortable. So let's not close things up too tight. Let's be very mindful of ammonia levels. This is a hard time of the year when calves can get some respiratory distress, especially when ventilation, kind of stale air, and that ammonia levels can get higher. So just work with bedding up your calves, and like I said, letting some ventilation in there. Just keep those drafts down and keep those calves healthy.
One quick question for you, Casey. When the air gets very dry, the dew points get very low. Does that have a negative impact?
I would think your humidity levels with those calves could lead to, some dampness that could maybe make your bedding a little more damp, maybe make those ammonia levels maybe a little stronger. So we have to think about, those calves are going to spend a vast majority of time laying down. Calves from 10 days of age to 4 weeks can average maybe 20 hours lying down. So we want to get in those pens and kind of get down at their level and see what that ammonia smells like. And you're right, those varying differences in the weather can create a little more, stagnant air. And so we just want to maybe, and there are systems available. We have very many resources within the dairy team, and some of our ag engineers on the team as well can even design these pressure tube ventilation systems. So if you have kind of a closed in system, there are ways to get some air movement in those kind of barns to kind of avoid those potential roadblocks and problems.
Okay, thank you so much. I do appreciate both of you joining me here for this podcast. I think we have a lot of great information, and thank you so much for joining me today. And we do want to tell folks that we'll probably be back here late winter and early spring to discuss going forward information for the summer and what the summer outlook is at that point. So that'll definitely be something for folks to look forward to. But this is a lot of great information that we have here.
Thank you.